ice flooded my veins. My 6-year-old son just marched up to the most lethal alpha king in the city and yanked on his tailored suit. "You look like me," Jax grinned. The king froze. He didn't know I was the rogue he spent one reckless night with 5 years ago. He didn't know he was looking at his own son. Then the first bullet shattered the glass. Fear tasted like old copper and cheap city rain, slipping over Kira's tongue as she flattened her spine against the alley brick. She dragged oxygen in through her teeth. The neon sign above her buzzed, casting a sickly red glare across the black puddles at her feet. She needed to keep moving. But 5 years of looking over her shoulder had turned her muscles to lead. Her thumb slipped on the tiny glass vial she clutched like stolen gold. It took 2 tries to crack the seal on the decrypted Shadow Market purchase. Acidic ozone and artificial mint flooded the cramped space, stinging her eyes as she smeared the liquid over her pulse points. The Eastern Syndicate owned these cracked sidewalks. If their sweepers caught her scent, they would find the twins. She would bleed out in the gutter before she let them near her pups. How long could a rabbit run from a wolf before its heart simply burst? She pushed the thought away as a low, mechanical rumble vibrated through the pavement. Kira peeked around the damp brick. An armored black SUV crawled down the street, the Syndicate crest gleaming sharp on the passenger door. The air stalled in her lungs. She stared at the dark, tinted glass, wondering if the Alpha King was hunting tonight. The wild, intoxicating scent of him from 5 years ago crashed into her memory, choking her. It was one anonymous night she fought daily to bury. To keep her children breathing, she kept them in the absolute dark. Myla had his piercing eyes. Jax had his destructive temper. Guilt twisted like a rusted knife in her gut as she pulled her wet hood up to shield her face. The wind shifted, bringing the distinct stench of wet fur and burnt powder. The men closing in smelled entirely wrong. A rival pack was bleeding into the neutral zone. A gunshot ripped the night wide open. The crack of the rifle bounced off the concrete, vibrating right through her boots. She didn't check if the bullet was meant for the Syndicate or the broker she'd just paid. She just spun. Her boots slammed into the standing water, churning up trash and mud as she broke into a dead sprint. A rogue wolf in this city ended up as a rug, so she swallowed her animal down and ran on fragile human legs. The freezing rain soaked through her thin jacket, but she pushed harder. With every frantic stride, the gunfire amplified, echoing directly from her residential block. She squeezed the empty glass vial until the edge bit into her palm. The sharp pain, the only thing keeping her tethered as she tore around the final corner toward her pups.
Far above the neon and the rain, blood ruined a priceless wool rug. Roman stared down at the traitor cooling on his office floor, projecting a mask of carved stone. He wiped a solitary red speck from the cuff of his tailored jacket. Around him, his inner circle stood bolted to the walls of the penthouse boardroom. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to scrape a shoe against the floorboards. Executing his own lieutenant for leaking shipping routes should have meant something. But the victory just tasted like ash. Roman turned his back on the corpse, pouring a measure of amber whiskey into a crystal glass. The liquor burned a clean trail down his throat, washing away the violence. Dust motes danced in the muted light. He waited for the rush of dominance to hit. It never did. Ultimate power was nothing but a suffocating cage. His pack bred vipers, and without a Luna to anchor his sanity, the betrayal chewed at his borders. Then the ghost hit him. Ozone, crushed mint. It bypassed his logic and sank claws right into his chest, dragging up the memory of a fiery, nameless girl from 5 years ago. He had gutted the slums looking for her. He had torn apart the elite clubs, nothing. A sharp burst of static crackled in his right ear, shattering the quiet. Alpha. His security chief's voice clipped through the earpiece. We have a situation in the neutral zone. Sector 4. Roman set the crystal glass down. The sharp clink on the oak desk echoed like a gunshot. Report? Rival Syndicate is making a push. They are hitting our patrol vehicles. It's a full turf war down there. Sector 4 was a gritty, lawless maze of flickering lights and mechanical rot. A low rumble vibrated in Roman's chest. Nobody touched his territory. He was the king, and he answered disrespect with absolute violence. Prep the armored convoy, Roman ordered, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I am going down there. Sir, it's too dangerous. We suspect a mole tipped them off. Roman leveled a dead stare across the room. The security chief snapped his mouth shut. Under the crushing weight of his attention, the remaining men stared at their shoes. They feared the monster, but they did not love the man. Without a second thought, Roman stepped right over the dead lieutenant's outstretched hand. He walked out the door without looking back. The private elevator hissed open, dropping him rapidly toward the ground floor. The air in the subterranean garage smelled instantly of exhaust and hot rubber. Black transport vehicles idled in the harsh fluorescent light. He didn't care about the turf war or the lost revenue. He just needed to destroy something tonight. Roman slid into the back of the lead vehicle. The armored door slammed shut, sealing him inside the rolling vault. Drive, he commanded the empty air. The convoy tore up the ramp and out into the flooded streets, speeding straight toward the slums. He watched the rain wash the city glass clean, but it could not wash away the phantom scent of mint that haunted his every breath.
The stairs burned her thighs as Kira kicked her way through the apartment door. She threw her entire weight against the cheap wood, slamming the deadbolt home with violently shaking hands. "Jax! Mila!" she yelled, her voice cracking. Two small heads popped up from behind a worn-out sofa. Mila clutched a stuffed rabbit, while her 6-year-old brother gripped a rusted iron wrench he'd found in the alley. They stared at her with wide, golden eyes. His eyes. "Mommy, there are loud pops outside," Mila whispered. "I know, baby." Kira slid to her knees on the scuffed linoleum, dragging a faded duffel bag from under the sofa. "We have to play the quiet game now. We have to leave." Gunfire popped again, closer this time. She shoved 2 clean shirts and a loaf of bread into the bag, her hands moving frantically. The walls of this building were paper. A stray bullet would punch right through the plaster. She grabbed the small vial of suppressant from her pocket. "Wrists out, pups." Jax frowned, crossing his little arms. "I hate the smelly spray. It makes my nose itch." "I don't care, Jax. Do it," she snapped. The shout bounced off the thin walls. The little boy flinched, and Kira's heart cracked right down the middle. She grabbed his tiny shoulders, pulling him into a fierce, desperate hug. "I'm sorry," she choked out, against his hair. "I'm so sorry, brave wolf, but you have to wear it. You have to hide to survive." She dabbed the harsh, chemical liquid onto their little wrists and necks. The sharp bite of ozone and mint filled the tiny room, swallowing their sweet, natural puppy scent. A violent explosion shook the floorboards, knocking a framed drawing off the wall. Drywall dust rained down, coating their wet hair. Kira didn't speak. She let the ringing in her ears fade, tasting chalk on her tongue before she finally moved. Time to go. Kira slung the duffel over her shoulder and grabbed their small hands. They ran for the back fire escape. The rusty metal door shrieked in protest as she shoved it open, letting the freezing rain slap their faces. The alleyway below was a chaotic nightmare of burning trash cans and screaming neighbors. Red and blue neon lights reflected in the dirty, ankle-deep water. Kira kept her body positioned over the twins, shielding them from the cold as they slipped down the rusted iron stairs. By the time their boots hit the ground, the sound of automatic gunfire was deafening. "Stay behind me," she ordered. They crept along the damp brick, aiming for the narrow exit. If they could just reach the subway tunnels, they could vanish underground. Then the world tilted. An armored black transport smashed into the alley mouth, crushing a flaming trash barrel beneath its tires. Sparks shrieked against the wet pavement. Kira froze. Her blood turned to ice. It was the Eastern Syndicate. Tactical units poured out of the back doors, returning fire at the gang members on the rooftops. Bullets chipped the brick wall mere inches from Kira's head, sending stone shrapnel flying. "Mommy!" Mila cried out. Through the smoke and the rain, the passenger door of the lead transport slowly pushed open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the downpour. His ruined suit clung to him, projecting a quiet, lethal stillness that made the surrounding crossfire feel like background noise. It was him, Roman. Before Kira could drag her pups back into the shadows, a tiny hand slipped out of her grip. "Jax, no," Kira hissed, lunging forward. She grabbed nothing but damp air. Her 6-year-old son marched straight out into the bloody rain, pulling his sister right toward the exact monster Kira had sacrificed her soul to escape. Terror ripped the oxygen from her lungs. Kira's boots skidded over the slick asphalt as she lunged from the brick alleyway. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums, drowning out the erratic pop of automatic rifles. "Jax!" she screamed. The shout tore her throat raw. But her brave, foolish son didn't stop. He marched directly toward the towering stranger in the ruined suit. Rain lashed against the street, washing blood into the gutters. The Alpha King stood perfectly still, his golden gaze sweeping the crossfire, before dropping to the 2 tiny children at his boots. Jax aimed a dirt-streaked finger at Roman. "You look like us." The crossfire seemed to mute. Raindrops shattered against the hood of the idling transport. Roman turned to absolute stone, staring down at the defiant boy while Mila shrank behind her brother's shoulders. Pure maternal instinct hijacked Kira's brain. She launched her body across the open asphalt. Bullets kissed the air inches from her skull, chewing into the concrete and shattering a neon sign overhead. Glass rained down. She ignored it entirely. She slammed into her pups, wrapping her arms around their small frames and dragging them to the flooded street. The impact tore the denim at her knees. She dragged a jagged breath of exhaust fumes, baring her teeth at the king like a cornered stray. A high-pitched whistle sliced the night open. "RPG!" a mercenary roared from the driver's seat. A grey smoke trail snaked down from the roofline, aimed directly at the engine block. Roman didn't dive for the brick wall. He blurred. Dark, violent motion closed the distance before Kira could even blink. She kicked up, her boot aiming for his knee. He simply absorbed the blow, hooking his arm under her jacket and snatching both children by their collars. He hurled them all into the cavernous back of the armored transport. He threw his own body in right behind them as the warhead detonated. The shockwave lifted the vehicle off its tires. Heat scorched the air outside. The blast slammed the reinforced doors shut with an echoing metallic thud. Automatic locks clicked into place. They had survived the blast, but the steel trap had just sealed her inside the dark with the exact predator she'd spent half a decade outrunning.
The explosion vibrated right through the reinforced chassis, tossing Roman onto the floorboards. Complete darkness swallowed the cabin. Acrid smoke and burning rubber choked the enclosed space, making his eyes water. He dragged himself up onto one knee, waiting for the high-pitched ringing in his skull to fade. Beneath the stench of explosives, a distinctly sharp note punched through the air. Ozone. Crushed mint. His wolf slammed against his ribs, clawing at his sanity. He knew that scent. He reached up, blindly slapping the overhead console until the yellow cabin light clicked on. The dim bulb flickered, revealing the rogue woman wedged into the farthest corner of the leather bench. She shielded the 2 children with her body, her chest hitched with frantic, shallow breaths. In her right hand, she gripped a jagged, sheared-off water pipe, the rusted tip pressed perfectly flush against his carotid artery. The hum of the engine vibrated up through his dress shoes. The rain drummed a muted rhythm against the bulletproof glass. He stared into her wide, furious eyes, watching the wildfire he remembered from 5 years ago burn just as bright. Then, his gaze drifted past her white-knuckled grip. The boy peeked around her damp sleeve. Dark hair framed a fiercely stubborn jaw. But it was the blinding, predatory gold of the child's irises that ripped the air right out of Roman's lungs. Next to the boy, the little girl clutched a filthy stuffed rabbit, blinking up with those exact same golden eyes. His own blood stared back at him. "Mine," his beast snarled, a territorial possessiveness taking root in his chest. An hour ago, he had sat in his boardroom, hollow and surrounded by traitors. Now, his entire legacy was bleeding on his back seat. Whoever sold his route to the rival gang wanted him erased tonight, and this armored box was the only secure location left on the grid. Roman slammed a fist against the partition grate. "Drive, get us to the tower, now." The engine roared, tires screaming for traction, before the transport violently launched out of the burning alley. Roman turned back to the woman. He slowly raised his palms, presenting no threat. "Put the weapon down," he rumbled, pitching his voice low to soothe. She didn't blink. She just dug the rusted metal deeper into his skin, right over the racing pulse of his throat, and waited for him to bleed.
The suspension groaned as the transport launched over a busted curb, throwing Kira back against the plush upholstery. City lights blurred past the reinforced windows in streaks of wet neon. She scanned the interior, mapping the stripped door panels and the sheer thickness of the glass. The cage was hermetically sealed. "Who are you running from?" Roman asked. His tone was stripped of the violence outside. It was a terrifying, calculated calm. Kira locked her jaw. Silence was her only armor left. "Mommy, my ears hurt," Mila whimpered, burying her face into Kira's torn jacket. The maternal instinct immediately trumped the standoff. Kira lowered the rusted pipe, dropping it onto the floorboards with a dull clatter. She hauled Mila onto her lap, pressing her palms flat over the little girl's ears. "It's okay, sweetie. The loud pops are gone." Roman tracked every micro-expression on her face. He leaned in, letting the distance between them shrink. The expensive cedar of his cologne rolled over her, tangled with the dominant, overwhelming musk of his wolf. It made her vision swim. "You smell like mint," Roman murmured. "You have been masking your scent from me." Kira swallowed, the dry lump in her throat, staring stubbornly at a water droplet sliding down the window pane. The vehicle banked hard, slowing as iron gates parted ahead of them. They rolled into an immaculate underground garage. Fluorescent lights reflected off the polished concrete. Tactical guards with assault rifles flanked every pillar, their eyes tracking the king's transport. The claustrophobia violently gripped her ribcage. "We are here," Roman stated, adjusting his ruined cuffs. Nobody will hurt you inside my walls." The electronic locks disengaged with a sharp chirp. The passenger door swung wide, revealing 2 towering enforcers waiting in the frigid garage air. "Get out," Roman instructed. Kira slung her damp duffel over her shoulder, snagging Jax's hand while balancing Mila on her hip. She stepped out onto the pristine concrete. A private glass elevator waited dead ahead, plunging straight down from the penthouse. She marched toward the opening doors, spine straight, refusing to show the predators her fear. She had spent 5 years sprinting through the gutter, only to deliver her pups directly into the lion's den. Roman stepped into the elevator right behind her, his broad chest boxing her in. The glass doors slid shut, sealing with a final, echoing chime, as his golden eyes locked dead onto her neck. The glass elevator doors parted with a soft, expensive whisper. Kira stepped off the polished metal grate, her battered boots leaving wet, muddy smears across the pristine white marble of the fortress penthouse. The air up here tasted entirely different, a sterile mix of chemical lemon cleaner and chilled, recycled oxygen. She dropped her damp duffel onto the floorboards, letting the canvas slap the stone. Immediately, her eyes swept the perimeter. She tested the thick window latches, tracked the brutal angles of the sniper sightlines overlooking the city, and counted the blinking red diodes of the security cameras. A cage was still a cage, even if the bars were cast in gold. "Mommy, look!" Jax yelled. Kira pivoted on her heel. Jax and Mila bounced on a plush velvet sofa, their giggles echoing off the vaulted ceiling. They had found a silver tray resting on a glass table and were currently shoving chocolate pastries into their mouths, leaving dark smears on their cheeks. A sharp ache wedged itself under Kira's ribs, 5 years of starving in the gutter, and now they were eating like royalty. She remembered a story the shadow brokers used to tell, a freezing stray dog invited to sleep by a warm fire, only to find the doors locked in the morning. She forced herself to breathe, letting them eat while she tracked the perimeter toward the kitchen. As she rounded a marble island, a blinking red light caught her eye. The service elevator keypad flashed an error code. Someone had bypassed the lock. She catalogued that dangerous loose end, storing it away in her mind. Then the air shifted. The distinct scent of cedar and ozone rolled over her shoulders. Kira spun around. Roman blocked the doorway. He had shed his ruined suit jacket. The sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled to the elbows, exposing bruised knuckles. He looked exhausted, yet entirely lethal. "The guards are dismissed." His deep voice vibrated against the quiet marble. "You are alone with me now." Kira shoved Jax and Mila behind her knees, dropping her hand toward the rusted pipe hidden in her pocket as she met the predator's stare.
By the time Roman navigated the vaulted corridor to his private study, a dull throb hammered directly behind his eyes. He shoved the solid oak door shut, letting the brass latch click into place before sinking into his leather chair. Across the dark room, a wall of security monitors glowed with a cool, blue light. He watched Kira. She paced the perimeter of his living room like a trapped tiger, dragging her boots over his expensive rugs. She was absolutely fierce. Most wolves dropped their gaze to the floorboards when he entered a room, crushed by the dominance in his blood. Instead, she bared her teeth. It sent a dangerous, electric thrill straight down his spine. He leaned forward, hitting a button on his encrypted console. "Talk." "Alpha." His security chief's voice cracked through the speaker, tight with stress. "We pulled the data from the burnt transport. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Someone fed them our exact GPS coordinates." Roman's blood turned to ice. "An inside job." "Yes, sir. Someone very high up the chain." The circle of men holding that route was incredibly small. The threat had crawled out of the slums and was currently standing inside his own house. Roman stared at the blank wall, remembering the dying lieutenant bleeding out on his office rug earlier that evening. The traitor had bubbled a single name through the blood. A name Roman couldn't decipher over the ringing in his ears. He filed the mystery away. He needed loyalty. He demanded the truth. Roman dragged his attention back to the glowing monitors. His pulse hitched. Kira was not resting. She was not sleeping. She was currently ripping a braided silk lamp cord straight out of the wall. With sharp, frantic movements, she tied the wire across the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. She was building a crude, lethal tripwire right inside his penthouse. A dark, Predatory smile curved Roman's mouth. She wasn't acting like a victim waiting for slaughter. She was a warrior preparing for a siege. His billion-dollar security grid meant nothing compared to the wild rogue actively dismantling his furniture. He pushed himself out of the chair, knowing he had to intercept her before she accidentally gutted one of his men.
As the muted quiet settled over the vast penthouse, Kira yanked the final knot tight on her braided silk tripwire. The friction burned her palms, and the scraped skin on her knees stung with every movement. But she pushed the pain away. A sharp, metallic clack echoed through the foyer. The front door handle was turning. Her pulse spiked into her throat. Roman had explicitly claimed the guards were gone. The mahogany door swung open. A towering, scarred enforcer stepped onto the white marble, a syndicate badge gleaming on his tactical vest. He did not look friendly, his dark eyes locked onto the children's discarded shoes, a cruel sneer twisting his mouth. "So," the enforcer grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "These are the rumored pups." He took a booted step toward the dark hallway where Jax and Mila slept. Kira exploded from the shadows. She didn't scream or hesitate. She dropped her center of gravity, sweeping her leg hard against his knee joint, while hooking her arm tightly around his thick neck. Fighting for scraps in the mud taught you exactly how to break a larger opponent's balance. The giant crashed to the floor. The impact shook the marble, rattling the silver tray on the glass table. Dust motes swirled in the sudden violent quiet. Kira didn't give him a chance to breathe. She ripped the sheared-off pipe from her pocket and jammed the rusted point directly under his jaw. A single bead of red welled up against the jagged metal. "Move, and you bleed," she whispered. The sound was flat, dead, and absolute. "Stop." The single word boomed through the space. Kira flicked her eyes up. Roman stood at the end of the hall, his golden gaze locked onto the bloody scene. He didn't look angry that she was a fraction of an inch away from executing his soldier. Instead, his broad chest rose and fell with rapid, uneven breaths. A look of raw, consuming hunger tightened his sharp features. He was completely obsessed. "Get out of my penthouse," Roman ordered the enforcer, dropping his tone to a lethal rumble. "She answers to no one but me." The bruised guard scrambled backward, scrambling out the door and letting it click shut behind him. Kira slowly rose to her feet, rolling her shoulders back while keeping a white-knuckled grip on her weapon. She watched the Alpha King cross the room, his dress shoes silent on the stone. The temperature between them spiked, thick with cedar and adrenaline. Roman stopped merely an inch from her face, staring down at the rusty pipe before dragging his eyes up to meet her defiant stare. "Teach me how you did that," he commanded softly, reaching out to wrap his fingers over hers.
The air inside the syndicate boardroom tasted like stale copper and stagnant breath. Roman stood at the head of the long marble table, his fingers biting into the polished edge until a hairline fracture spiderwebbed through the stone. He dragged a slow breath over his teeth. The sharp sound echoed off the wood paneling, making the 3 remaining lieutenants shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "She is a spy," his beta spat, pointing a thick finger toward the ceiling. "She crawled out of the neutral zone slums to set up that convoy ambush." Roman didn't raise his voice. He leaned forward, letting his lethal, predatory calm blanket the room. "She is the mother of my heirs." The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody breathed. The lieutenants stared at the cracked marble under Roman's hands, calculating their survival odds. They wanted his throne, but the feral beast pacing behind Roman's ribs demanded a slaughter. He clamped down on the violent urge. He needed the real traitor first. Who leaked the root? The gurgling whisper of his dead lieutenant scratched at the back of his mind. A puzzle missing its final piece. Turning his back on the council, Roman walked out the door. His boots struck the floorboards with a steady, hollow rhythm as he abandoned the vipers to their plodding. He stepped into the private glass elevator, driving his thumb into the penthouse button. The steel doors sealed shut, locking him in a rising metal box as the war crept toward his front door.
The gentle hum of the penthouse climate control did nothing to settle the frantic energy burning through Kira's muscles. She sat perfectly rigid on the edge of the velvet sofa, her eyes locked on the flashing red diode of the service elevator keypad. The security code was entirely bypassed. A rusted iron pipe rested across her lap. The steel service doors blew off their hinges. A concussive shockwave knocked Kira backward over the sofa. Drywall dust plumed into the pristine living room, raining shattered glass from the overhead fixtures. She tasted chalk and burnt powder. A sharp, high-pitched ringing pierced her eardrums. She waited for her vision to stop spinning before rolling onto her stomach. 3 mercenaries marched through the grey smoke. Dressed in tactical black, they swept silenced rifles across the open floor plan. They had bypassed a billion-dollar grid without tripping a single alarm. A soft chime cut through the destruction. Roman's private front elevator slid open, delivering the Alpha King directly into the kill box. "Get down!" Kira screamed, her throat scraping raw. Muzzle flashes lit up the smoke. Automatic fire chewed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, inviting the freezing night wind to howl through the penthouse. Kira didn't crawl for the exit. Her boots found traction on the ruined rug. She vaulted over the kitchen island, snatching a chef's knife from the magnetic block. She drove the blade deep into the nearest mercenary's forearm, ripping a wet scream from his throat. Across the room, Roman didn't bother shifting fully. Dark claws tore through his ruined cuffs as he closed the distance in a brutal blur. So ripping the second assassin's throat open with his bare hands, the third man pivoted, aiming his rifle squarely at Roman's exposed spine. Kira launched herself off the marble counter. She slammed into Roman's side just as the rifle cracked. A white-hot spike drove through her left shoulder, punching the air from her lungs. She hit the stone floor hard. Bones snapped with a sickening crunch as Roman broke the final assassin's neck. The body crumpled to the floor. The wind screamed through the shattered glass, swirling snow and smoke over the blood-stained marble, while Kira clutched her bleeding chest.
Snowflakes drifted through the broken windows, melting against the cooling bodies on the floor as Roman dropped to his knees. He pressed his shaking palms over the ragged hole in Kira's jacket. Hot blood spilled over his knuckles, the sharp metallic stench fighting against her scent of ozone and mint. "Look at me," Roman commanded, his voice fracturing. "Keep your eyes open." He scooped her up off the cold stone, ignoring the ruin of his territory. He carried her down the hall, laying her gently onto the pristine white silk of the master bed. The crimson stain spread immediately. He ripped a trauma kit from the wall mount, tearing the plastic packaging with his teeth before jamming coarse gauze against her torn flesh. Kira swallowed a jagged groan. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded her mouth. She blinked up at the Alpha King, watching the ruthless predator completely unravel. Unshed tears caught the light in his golden eyes. The iron wall she had built over 5 years cracked right down the middle. This wasn't a monster hunting a rogue. He was just a terrified father trying to keep her breathing. "Just a graze," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. His hands trembled against her skin. Roman dropped his chin, pressing his forehead carefully against hers. "I don't know who to trust," he confessed into the quiet room. "My pack is poisoned." It cost the king everything to admit his empire was rotting from the inside. Kira felt that profound, isolating loneliness ache in her own chest. Forcing her good arm up, she dragged her knuckles over his stubbled jaw. "Your cameras are blind," Kira rasped. Your men are lying. She dug her fingers into her blood-soaked pocket, pulling out a cracked plastic burner phone. Her street instincts were sharper than his corporate security. "Let me use my ghosts," she offered, her eyes locking onto his. "I will hunt your rat down." Roman closed his eyes. When he finally nodded, he surrendered his crumbling kingdom directly to the rogue queen.
The sharp bite of chemical cleaner failed to mask the lingering stench of burnt powder in the penthouse. Kira sat cross-legged on the icy bathroom tiles, ignoring the dull, throbbing heat radiating from her bandaged shoulder. Her thumb smeared dried blood across the cracked screen of her burner phone as she punched in a decrypted sequence. She fired the serial numbers from the dead mercenaries' rifles straight to her underworld broker. The screen froze, illuminating her face in a sickly blue glow. She waited, tracking the pulse hammering against her bruised throat. A compressed ledger file decrypted across the glass. Offshore routing numbers linked the rival gang's payroll directly back to the Eastern Syndicate. Below the transfers, a name materialized: the Beta. Roman's second-in-command was orchestrating a midnight weapons transfer at the shipyards. Kira pushed off the tiles, her boots slipping slightly on the polished floor as she marched toward the grand study. Roman stood perfectly still by the cracked floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the fog rolling over the city skyline. He looked hollowed out, the rigid posture of a king waiting for the walls to breach. "I found your rat," Kira stated. Her voice held zero tremor. Roman turned, his golden eyes tracking her movement as he plucked the cheap plastic device from her fingers. The blue light washed over his sharp features. He didn't roar, he didn't shatter the desk. Instead, the absolute stillness of a predator, accepting a lethal truth, settled over his frame. The air pressure in the room simply collapsed. He tossed the phone onto the leather blotter. Reaching back, he slid a black tactical pistol from his waistband and racked the slide. The metallic clack severed the silence. "Lock the doors," Roman ordered, his voice stripped of all warmth. He walked past her without another glance. The oak door shut behind him, the deadbolt tumbling into place with a definitive click, sealing her inside the epicenter of a pack war.
Rain lashed against the windshield of the stolen sports car as Roman tore down the interstate, leaving the penthouse far behind. The leather interior smelled of ozone and impending violence. He bypassed the armored convoys entirely, arriving at Warehouse 9 as a solitary ghost. The rusted hinges of the loading door groaned in the sea breeze. Roman didn't bother picking the lock. He drove his boot directly into the steel deadbolt. The metal sheared. The door crashed flat onto the damp concrete, sending rats scurrying into the shadows. Inside the cavernous space, the Beta stood flanked by 5 rival mercenaries. They pivoted, raising their assault rifles. Roman let the beast rip through his restraint. Dark claws shredded his leather driving gloves, just as muzzle flashes lit the damp room. He launched himself over a stack of shipping crates while bullets chewed the pine into flying splinters behind him. He landed hard, driving his claws straight through the nearest gunner's throat and sweeping the legs out from the second. Bone snapped over the chaotic crack of gunfire. The remaining mercenaries scrambled backward, choking on the sudden copper mist hanging in the air. Roman stood slowly. He let the ringing in his ears fade, tasting salt on his tongue as he locked eyes with his former brother. The Beta dropped his rifle. He spun and sprinted for the open loading dock where an idling speedboat bobbed in the dark water. Roman leveled his pistol, squeezing the trigger. The crack echoed off the tin roof. The bullet took the Beta in the calf, but the traitor tumbled forward, knocked crashing over the fiberglass hull as the boat roared away into the black current. Lowering the smoking barrel, Roman stalked toward the makeshift command desk in the center of the warehouse. A set of architectural blueprints lay unrolled across the wood. He dragged his bloody thumb over the paper. It was the fortress penthouse. Red markers circled the precise location of the guest bedroom where his pups slept. The digital clock on the desk flashed 11:45 p.m. The coup wasn't happening at the docks. It was happening right now. Roman sprinted for the exit. Just as his boots cleared the threshold, a supersonic crack split the night. A high-caliber sniper round punched cleanly through his side, throwing him violently against the wet brick. He hit the pavement hard, tasting blood and rain as his vision fractured into static.
The quiet inside the penthouse felt suffocating. Kira paced the marble foyer, tracking the slow, agonizing crawl of the digital clock ticking past midnight. The front door crashed open, slamming into the drywall. Roman stumbled across the threshold, leaving a thick, slick trail of crimson across the white stone. He collapsed against the entryway console, his breath tearing through his teeth in wet, ragged gasps. Kira didn't scream. Her street medic instincts hijacked her panic. She slid across the floor, catching his broad shoulders just as his knees buckled. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she held on, lowering the Alpha King to the marble. The beta, Roman choked out, coughing a spray of blood onto his ruined shirt. He knows about the pups. Kira ripped his soaked shirt open, exposing the jagged entry wound below his ribs. Arterial blood pumped entirely too fast. She grabbed a discarded fleece blanket from the sofa, balling it up and driving her entire body weight down onto the hole. Roman let out a guttural groan, his head snapping back against the stone. She tasted salt on her lips, realizing she was crying only when a tear dropped onto his collarbone. He was burning with a supernatural fever, the heat radiating straight through her denim jeans. "Look at me," Kira ordered, her voice cracking as she pressed harder. "You stay awake. You do not leave us." Roman dragged his blood-slicked hand up, wrapping his long fingers weakly around the back of her neck. He pulled her down, his golden eyes blown wide with a desperate, terrifying clarity. His mouth crashed into hers. There was no romance in it. It was a messy collision of teeth and desperation. It tasted of copper, sweat, and sheer survival. Kira anchored her hands in his hair, kissing the dying predator back, with every ounce of defiant fire she possessed. It was a vicious claiming, cementing the bond on a ruined floor. As their lips parted, the sharp hum of the penthouse climate control abruptly died. The overhead lights snapped off. Total suffocating darkness swallowed the room. The backup generators failed to engage. Kira held her breath, listening to the silence until a new sound drifted through the pitch-black foyer. The methodical, rhythmic thud of tactical boots climbing the private stairwell.
Total darkness suffocated the foyer. The rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoed up the private stairwell, vibrating through the marble floorboards right beneath Roman's spine. The reinforced steel security shutters slammed down over the broken windows, sealing the penthouse completely. His billion-dollar fortress had just become a sealed vault. A concussive shockwave ripped through the subflooring. The explosion rocked the skyscraper's foundation, tearing out the drywall and raining plaster dust into the pitch-black air. Roman drove his good elbow into the ruined floor, forcing his torso upright. The bullet wound in his side burned like battery acid. Smoke choked the room, layering over the sour stench of unwashed mercenaries breaching the outer corridor. His corporate technology had locked him inside a cage with an execution squad. Gritting his teeth against the torn muscle, he planted his boots and stood. "Kira," he bellowed, the sound tearing his throat raw. "Get the pups." He dragged himself toward the reinforced entry doors just as the steel hinges buckled. A breaching charge detonated. The blast blew the doors inward, followed immediately by a rolling metal canister. A flashbang ignited. White, blinding heat seared his sensitive retinas. Roman fell back, his vision fracturing into pure static as tactical units swarmed the breach. Operating entirely on predatory instinct, he launched his bleeding frame into the flood of bodies. He caught an incoming wrist, snapping the bone with a vicious twist. He drove his knee into a tactical vest, crushing the mercenary's windpipe. But the blood loss slowed his reflexes. Rifles cracked in the dark. Cock-and armored bodies piled over him, driving the bleeding king straight down onto the broken marble.
Acrid smoke rolled under the nursery door, stinging Kira's eyes as she ripped Jax and Mila from their beds. She crushed their small frames against her chest, wrapping her torn jacket around their heads to filter the soot. "Mommy," Mila coughed, burying her face into Kira's neck. "I have you," Kira rasped, securing the canvas duffel over her uninjured shoulder. She kicked the bedroom door open, stepping out into the chaotic hallway. Muzzle flashes illuminated the dark foyer in stroboscopic bursts. Through the chaos, she spotted Roman buried under a swarm of tactical gear, his movements sluggish and dripping red. Before she could drop the bag and sprint toward him, a secondary explosive breached the living room wall. The shockwave picked her straight up off her feet. She flew backward, her spine colliding violently with a load-bearing concrete pillar. The air vanished from her lungs. She crumpled to the floorboards, completely paralyzed. Plaster rained down in the sudden ringing quiet. She lay curled on her side, tasting chalk and waiting for her paralyzed diaphragm to pull oxygen. As her vision cleared, the smoke parted. The beta stood by the gaping shaft of the private elevator, a cruel sneer twisting his mouth. He held a thrashing child under each arm. Jax kicked wildly, while Mila screamed over the ringing in Kira's ears. "The king's pups will fetch a premium in the neutral zone," the beta stated flatly. He stepped backward into the glass elevator cab. The steel doors engaged, sliding together. Pure feral adrenaline punched through Kira's paralysis. She dug her fingernails into the cracked stone and dragging her battered body forward. "Jax!" The locks engaged with a sharp click. The mechanical gears whined and the cab plummeted down the shaft, swallowing her pups into the dark. A deep, structural groan vibrated through the floorboards. The damaged ceiling snapped. A jagged slab of concrete plummeted from the roofline, crashing directly across Kira's legs and pinning her flat against the floor as the entire room collapsed. Total blackness swallowed the wreckage. Kira couldn't expand her ribs. A jagged slab of concrete pinned her lower half to the floorboards, the sheer density crushing the breath right out of her lungs. She tasted dust, dirt, and warm copper. The chaotic gunfire faded into a muffled, suffocating quiet. She lay perfectly still, under the ruins of the King's Tower. Rats in the slums would chew off their own limbs to escape an iron trap. She would gladly sever her own legs to reach the elevator shaft, but the rubble refused to budge. Her muscles trembled and gave out entirely. The crushing weight wasn't just concrete. It was absolute failure. She had stopped running. She had let the predator kiss her, distracting her survival instincts just long enough for the vipers to strike. Now the pups were gone. She dropped her cheek against the cold. A filthy tile. Wet tears cut clean lines through the soot coating her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty dark. "I'm so sorry." The silence dragged out until a harsh, grating scrape vibrated through the floor. A rock tumbled. Concrete ground against steel. Someone was violently tearing the debris apart above her. She refused to let the spark of hope ignite. Hope was a liar that got people killed. Then a slab of drywall ripped upward. A single beam of ambient city light pierced the choking dust, illuminating her face. A blood-soaked, ruined hand reached directly into the burial hole. "Kira!" A raw, broken voice commanded. It was Roman. The Alpha King had slaughtered his way through the dark, and he was digging his queen out of the rubble with his bare hands.
Concrete scraped against bone as Roman dug his fingers under the crushed pillar. His claws sheared through the steel rebar. Grunting, he hoisted the cracked slab up and hurled it away. The stone crashed against the far wall. Plaster dust snowed down from the ceiling, coating the ruins in a gray haze. In the center of the debris, his rogue lay motionless. Roman dropped to the cracked tile. Blood dripped from his torn knuckles. He slid his hands under her shoulders, pulling her limp frame against his chest. Her skin felt cold. Beneath the grime, a faint pulse tapped against her throat. He leaned down, pressing his mouth against her dust-coated forehead. The grit tasted like ash. "Kira." His voice wrecked from the smoke. "Wake up." A violent cough rattled her chest. Gray soot spilled from her cracked lips as her lashes fluttered. Of pain glazed her dark eyes, bleeding quickly into hard, sharp focus. She ignored the blood running down her temple. Her hands clawed into his ruined shirt, using his chest for leverage to pull herself upright. "The neutral zone," she rasped, swallowing hard. They took the pups to the shipyards. Roman stayed on his knees. He looked over her shoulder at the blown-out windows. Rain lashed through the shattered glass, washing the blood from the bodies of the mercenaries scattered across his penthouse floor. His empire was dead. He looked down at his hand. The gold syndicate ring cut into his knuckles. Hooking his thumb under the band, he slid it off. He tossed it into the rubble. The gold clattered against broken bricks and rolled away into the shadows. Kira tracked the movement. Her fingers tightened in his shirt. Rising to his feet, Roman hauled her up with him. He pulled her arm over his shoulder, bracing her weight against his side as they turned toward the hidden exit.
They bypassed the main halls, slipping behind the torn kitchen panels into the narrow maintenance shafts. Stale air hit Kira's face, thick with the stench of old grease and rusted pipes. She forced her boots to find traction on the slick metal rungs. Pain throbbed in her ribs with every step downward, but she kept moving. The dark was her territory. Behind her, the king followed her lead in complete silence. Eventually, the narrow ladder dropped them into the underground parking garage. The damp concrete floor stretched out under flickering fluorescent bulbs. Faint gunfire popped from the floors high above, muffled by layers of concrete. Down here, the air was still. In the far corner, a black motorcycle sat parked near a concrete pillar. Kira limped over. She snatched a wrench off a nearby utility cart and drove the steel tool straight into the ignition box. Plastic shattered. Reaching into the broken casing, she yanked a cluster of wires free. She stripped the casings with her teeth and struck the copper ends together. Sparks hissed. The engine roared to life, echoing violently off the low ceiling. Roman stepped in close. He straddled the seat behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His chest pressed hard against her spine. Heat radiated through his torn clothes, clashing with the cold basement air. The sharp scent of rain and copper settled over her collarbone. "I like watching you work," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Kira wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. She kicked the kickstand up. "Hold on." She twisted the throttle. The back tire spun, just screeching against the painted concrete before catching. They shot up the ramp, bursting out of the garage and tearing into the flooded neon-lit streets.
10 minutes of driving through the freezing downpours washed the ash from Roman's face. Kira killed the engine a block away from the neutral zone docks, letting the bike coast into an empty alley. They left the machine leaning against a brick wall and moved on foot. The shipyard loomed ahead, like a rusted iron graveyard. Shipping containers towered into the storm, blacking out the city lights. Rain hammered against the metal roofs, drowning out their footsteps as they wove through the deep, oil-slicked puddles toward Warehouse 9. Two guards stepped out from the space between the containers. Rain slicked off their tactical rifles. Neither Roman nor Kira broke stride. Kira dropped into a slide across the wet asphalt, driving a blade upward into the first guard's thigh. As the man buckled, Roman launched himself off a stack of wooden pallets. He slammed into the second guard, twisting the man's neck. Bone cracked sharply. Both bodies hit the ground. Roman stood up. He spit blood into a puddle. The storm raged around them, washing the fresh crimson into the gutter. They moved to the main warehouse entrance. Roman gripped the thick steel handle of the loading door. Kira stood beside him, her knuckles white around her knife. The freezing rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. Before he could pull the latch, a sound bled through the thick steel. A sharp, terrified sob. "Mila." Roman dropped his hand from the latch. The muscles in his forearms locked up. His bones shifted, popping under his skin as his shoulders broadened. Heat rolled off his skin, vaporizing the rain as it hit his neck. He turned his head toward the steel door, his pupils bleeding into solid gold. Kira stepped back, giving him room. Roman buried his claws into the steel frame, ready to rip the building apart.
Kira drove her boot into the steel latch. Metal shrieked, buckling inward under the force of the kick. The warehouse air hit her lungs, reeking of dead fish, wet rust, and copper. Under a swinging yellow bulb, in the center of the concrete floor, the beta pressed the barrel of a silver pistol against Jax's temple. Mila curled on the dirty cement. Her tiny hands clamped over her ears. Before Kira could take another step, 5 mercenaries racked the slides of their rifles, tracking her chest. "Drop the steel!" the beta screamed. Sweat tracked through the grime on his pale face. Metal clattered against the cement. Kira let her bloody hunting knife fall, raising her empty hands. Behind her, Roman's boots scraped the wet floor. His breathing sounded shallow and fast, rattling against the back of his throat. "You lose the board." "Roman," the beta sneered, gesturing toward the open bay doors. "That shipping container out back, packed to the roof with liquid silver artillery from the Volkov pack. Volkov, we're burning your bloodline to ash tonight." Kira kept her hands raised. She didn't look at the rifles. She stared at the smeared blood on Jax's cheek. The pulse in her neck beat a frantic, panicked rhythm, but her mind snapped into cold focus. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. She caught Roman in her periphery. No nod. Just a microscopic shift in his stance. Kira threw her weight sideways, diving hard to the right. She left the king completely unguarded. A gunshot ripped the air apart. The noise deafened the room, echoing violently off the corrugated iron roof. Roman hadn't even raised his weapon to his eye line, firing from his hip. Why, he sent a hollow-point bullet slicing through the exact space Kira had just vacated. The round caught the beta dead center in the forehead. Bone splintered. He folded inward, collapsing onto the concrete. As the ringing drowned out the rain, Kira slid across the slick floor. She snatched both pups against her chest, curling her spine to shield them, waiting for the mercenaries to pull their triggers.
The echo of the gunshot rolled into the rafters. Gun smoke curled from the barrel of Roman's pistol, mixing with the scent of wet iron. The king stepped under the yellow light, crushing a discarded shell casing under his boot. Nobody breathed. The 5 remaining mercenaries stared at the corpse of their commander, their rifles shaking. Roman didn't snarl. He didn't raise his voice. He rolled his shoulders back, letting the lethal, predatory tension bleed slowly out of his spine. The knuckles wrapped around his gun grip turned white. "The Eastern Syndicate belongs to me," Roman said. His voice dragged across the quiet room like broken glass. "Walk away. Tell Volkov his silver buys him nothing. Tell him the king claimed his Luna." Rifles hit the floor. The mercenaries backed away, turning and sprinting into the freezing downpour. Roman waited until their bootsteps faded into the storm. He engaged the safety on his pistol, shoving the weapon into his waistband before dropping his knees to the dirt. He dragged Kira and the twins into his chest. Mila buried her wet face in his neck, her small hands gripping his torn shirt. "Daddy," she sobbed. Roman closed his eyes. The sharp scent of ozone and cordite faded, replaced by the sweet mint on Kira's skin and the damp earth of his pups. His throat tightened, aching from the smoke. He pressed his face into the crown of Kira's hair. She tilted her chin up. Dirt smeared her cheek, mapping the hollows of her bruised face. "You trusted me," he murmured, the words scraping out of his chest. "You're mine," Kira answered, her voice raspy. He hooked his fingers into the back of her shirt and pulled her mouth to his. The kiss tasted like blood, rain, and survival. It wasn't rushed. He mapped the split in her lip, letting the heat of her skin ground the adrenaline still burning in his veins. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. He stared out at the dark entrance of the warehouse, his hand dropping back to the grip of his gun.
3 weeks of reconstruction turned the ruined fortress penthouse into a different world. Sunlight sliced through new ballistic glass, warming the thick woven rugs replacing the blood-stained tile. The scent of burning butter and maple syrup drifted from the kitchen, cutting through the sterile smell of fresh paint. Kira stood barefoot by the window. She wore one of Roman's black button-downs, the cotton hem brushing her bare thighs. The morning traffic hummed far below. She pressed her palm against the warm pane. Her boots were locked in the closet. The hunting knife sat in a drawer. Across the room, Jax tackled Mila into a pile of velvet cushions. Their laughter bounced off the vaulted ceiling. Footsteps crossed the hardwood behind her. Roman slipped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. His chin rested on the crown of her head. The steady, slow thump of his heartbeat tapped against her spine. "Border patrols reported in," Roman murmured, his voice low and raspy from sleep. Volkov pulled his scouts back past the river. "The city is dead quiet." "Good," Kira said. She turned in his arms, tracing the edge of his collarbone with her thumb. "Russians don't do well against a cornered wolf." Roman looked down at her. The sharp, guarded edge in his golden eyes had softened, but the quiet obsession remained. He lowered his head, pressing his nose against her jawline. "Your scent shifted," he whispered, inhaling deeply against her skin. "The panic is gone. The mint." He trailed his thumb over her bottom lip. "It smells like territory now." Heat flushed across her collarbone. Kira grabbed the front of his shirt, keep pulling him down into a slow, deliberate kiss. Her fingers dug into the hard muscle of his chest, anchoring him to her. She broke the kiss, keeping her mouth an inch from his. She dragged her nails lightly down his chest. "Lock the door, Alpha," she whispered, her eyes flashing dark,